And we are live. While there are countless examples of people who have been abused, abandoned, and neglected by the church, some question whether church hurt is a legitimate issue. We're going to talk about that and more on this episode of The Urban Perspective. You are tuned into The Urban Perspective. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a very important dialogue and topic this morning as we talk about my latest book, Church Hurt, Holding the Church Accountable and Helping Hurt People Heal. I'm joined here by a man that needs no introduction, but for those that are going to be meeting him for the first time, I want to introduce you guys to Dr. Dwayne Bond. He is an adjunct professor of biblical counseling at Grimkey Seminary. Dwayne is the lead pastor of Wellspring Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, which he planted in 2007. He's a board member of the Acts 29 network and serves as the director of pastoral care for the network. In addition to pastoring, he has a passion for equipping the next generation of biblical counselors. He is on the board of directors for the Biblical Counseling Coalition. He is the author of numerous online articles and contributor to Christ-Centered Biblical Counseling, Changing Lives with God's Changeless Truth. He has a Bachelor of Science in Finance from Maryland, the University of Maryland, a Master's of Arts from Liberty University, a Master of Arts in Biblical Counseling from Capital Bible Seminary, and a Doctorate of Philosophy in Professional Counseling from Liberty University. Thank you so much, Dr. Bond, for joining us here on The Urban Perspective.
Hey, it's good to be with you, brother. Good to be with you, man. You make me sound important.
Hey, man, that's because you are, man. That's because you are, man. I can't thank you enough. Hey, guys, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to youtube.com/The Urban Perspective. You can follow me there. Also, get this latest book at jeromegayjr.com/Church Hurt. Listen, church hurt is definitely a hot topic within the church. And before we dive in, as Dr. Bond is lending us his expertise, his wisdom, his pastoral care and counsel, I think it's important that we should define it so we have a working definition as we get into these questions. So when we talk about church hurt, family, this is what we're referring to. Church hurt refers to the pain inflicted by religious institutions, their members, and or their leadership. A pain, listen, that distances sufferers from their communities and sometimes God. So sometimes people begin to view God differently based on how they're treated by people who claim his name. And I do think it's important. I say this all the time. We must not blame Christ for what Christians do. Now, there are two types of church hurt. There's personal church hurt. This is when a believer hurts another believer, or a representative of the church doesn't operate in love and how they deal with others. And then there is structural church hurt. Structural church hurt, this is when leadership focuses on themselves and on winning people to themselves and sees the church as a means to be served rather than to serve. And I put that scriptural reference because it talks about Jesus, who did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So I wanted to have that as we dive into this discussion today, because Dr. Bond has extensive research and extensive just credentials to be able to talk to us about this. So let's dive right in. So I think it's first, we kind of said at the onset, Dr. Bond, some people even deny it. So some people deny the existence of church hurt. From a psychological standpoint, is church hurt a thing? Help us out.
Yeah, I think it's well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. I think this topic is just incredibly important. Church hurt is real. And I think if we don't accept it, the reality of it being that we are sinners living in a broken world, then more than likely we are possibly in denial. The reality of church hurt is real. I mean, think about it. A hospital is designed to be a place where broken, wounded, and harmed people come into it in order to be healed.
Yeah.
However, as you come into that hospital, you never anticipate the fact that those people in the hospital or those professionals who are designed and skilled and trained to bring healing would ever harm you, right?
Hmm.
So, the first thing that happens whenever something happens bad within a hospital to a harmed person, a malpractice suit takes place, right?
Right. Right.
But the church is no different. I mean, the church is a real place where wounded and broken people come in to be healed by Jesus. However, wounded people heal hurt people, and so in that process, um, people experience pain of abuse. They experience misuse of power. People who are unrepentant in their sin and how they sin
Mhm.
against each other. It goes without being accounted for, and thus people experience the pain. So you can come in with a hurt and then experience that hurt again and again and again and again. That's why we are called as Christians to repent. Repent when we hurt people and harm people. And so I think the Bible is littered with examples of hurting people. I mean, you think about Ephesians 31:32. Purposely, it says, get away from bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, slander. Put those things away. Be kind to one another. Be tenderhearted, forgiving one another as Christ has forgiven us. That's intentional because in the church, these type of sinful things take place. Romans 14:1 through 23 says, avoid quarreling over opinions. I mean, how many times you think about
Mhm.
people, whether in culture or in church, are harming one another over personal preferences and opinions, right?
Right.
Um, John 15:12, love one another. Proverbs 1:7, fear the Lord and do not be a fool that despises wisdom and instruction. Um, 1 John 1, walk in the light as he is in the light. Those scriptures are given because we have a tendency as sinners to bring harm to one another. So if you get hurt in the church, like everybody who's going to be a part of a church, you're going to experience some type of scrape. Hope it's not a dagger, but you're going to experience a scrape. But we just don't anticipate that we'll experience that scrape, and so when it happens, it kind of catches us off guard, and then sometimes people just leave or throw the church out as if Jesus doesn't matter to their lives. So yeah, I think it's a real thing, and I think it's a thing that we need to talk about. So your book is incredibly timely.
Yeah, and again, guys, we're joined here by Dr. Dwayne Bond, adjunct professor for counseling at Grimkey Seminary, and I love the example that you use about malpractice. If you go to the hospital, your only mindset is you're going there to get healed, and
Hmm.
so in some ways, the church can be guilty of spiritual malpractice when they come seeking healing. Now, obviously, the church itself isn't the source of the healing; Christ is, but we're supposed to be his ambassadors. And so,
Hmm. Hmm.
as his ambassadors, we shouldn't turn on each other. And scripture talks about how we end up devouring each other. And so, thank you for that beautiful example of kind of that correlation, between the church. So we've kind of established that yes, it is a thing. We shouldn't deny that it is a thing.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, because if a spiritual leader comes against a person, it's similar to a doctor using his power and authority to coerce a patient or control a patient or exploit a patient or harm a patient. And I think that's why just a high call for leaders to be kind-hearted, gracious, and not contentious, not quarrelsome, and don't use their power to bring harm, because you're just adding to that person's already wounded heart or broken heart or harmed heart. You know what I'm saying? I call it harmed heart.
Yeah. No. Thank you for that.
Hmm.
In light of that, so after establishing, hey, it is a thing. Oftentimes, I think sometimes the church we try to just quickly move on Or
hmm
one of the things I say in the book is we go into defense mode and we just
hmm
say, hey, my church isn't like that, right?
hmm
Not necessarily thinking about how this person has been impacted. So, what are the emotional, spiritual, and mental effects of spiritual abuse? Or some? I know you can't go through the entire exhaustive list, but yeah, what are some
Yeah,
of those emotional, spiritual, and mental effects?
yeah, I'll give you some of them, and I see those as all tied together, right? Because it's
Yeah,
hard to identify what's emotional, what's mental, what's spiritual. You know what I'm saying? So I see
yeah,
them as a
as a
three
collective.
chord, yeah, 3 chord rope. So I would say, man, anxiety, um, also being hyper vigilant, um, stress, a sense of shame, things like
Mm,
guilt and humiliation, intimidation. Intimidation's a big one. People just feel a sense of intimidated, over controlled, condescended, condemned,
mm.
traumatized, things
Wow.
like, again, I want to be careful about traumatized because I want to, everybody's saying trauma now, right? That's a buzzword of 22, 23, 2022 and 2023. I would say also preoccupied, dominated, or bullied. Um, those things are real. Shut down, devalued, used, drained. I would say that's another thing. Oppressed or attacked. I mean, it's
Wow.
a real thing. It's a real
That's,
thing.
can you expound on, you said shame. Why would I feel shame when I'm not the abuser? Because I
hmm
think you know what I mean? Like why
hmm
and again, we see this in like domestic violence situation where the woman blames herself even though she's the one being abused.
hmm
If you can break that a little bit, how come the abused is the one that feels shame?
Right, right. So when you control somebody's mental capacity, they can almost feel anything, right? But
Mm,
sometimes people feel shame because they are in that relationship, right? Or they're at
mm.
that church, or they made that choice to be a part of that church when they even saw some things that
Oh,
that they could have avoided, on the front end, right? Um, or those type of things. I mean, you see shame in sexual abuse because specifically, did I do something to deserve this? Did I do
wow.
something to bring this on? What about me is the problem that causes somebody to want to treat me like that?
Mm,
So that just creates a whole wealth of issues within that person's heart as they think about, like, what did I do? What did I do? And why out of all these people in this church, why am I experiencing what I'm experiencing? Right. So it brings this twisted sense of shame, which is actually real. It's a real feeling for them. Um,
yeah.
it may not be tethered to truth, but it's still an opportunity for us to just explore the idea of shame. I think another one would be unloved. That's a real simple one. You just don't
Mm.
feel loved, and so you divest yourself from the love of Christ, which is associated with the church, and then you just miss Christ Himself. So it's a
Nah,
it's
thank you
a
so
it's a
much. And yeah, thank you so much. What were you saying, Dr. Bond? I'm sorry.
no, 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 no. I'm just going to tap it off and just saying hurt people hurt people.
Yeah, and guys, I want you to please share this because this conversation is going to be crucial for helping people. Tag some of your friends. Since we released the book, we've seen already. It's only been a week, and we've seen countless people just kind of sharing their stories. And to what Dr. Bond just gave us a huge wisdom nugget on how the reason the abused blames themselves is because they begin to question why someone would treat them that way. And what we want to do with this conversation is free you from taking on the responsibility of the abuser. The abuser doesn't have there is no rationale for dehumanizing another human being. And so we want to free you from taking that on. And so even what you're feeling is real, right? So we're not denying that, as Dr. Bond said. One of the things I say at my church is your feelings are real, but they're not always right. And so while you may feel this sense of shame, we want you to know that you're not the reason someone is abusing you. You're not at fault for that, for someone else's sin against you. Dr. Bond, oftentimes this conversation of church hurt is one-sided. And what I mean by that is it's typically the pastor or leader, and this extends beyond the church, but pastoral leadership abusing the people. But I have a chapter in the book called "Attack from the Pews," and it kind of addresses that other perspective that people don't always consider, and that's how us as leaders experience it. And so, as someone in leadership in the church, what has been your experience with church hurt?
Yeah, that's real. And again, and it's just,
Yeah,
again, and dealing with a pastor's hurt or a leader's hurt or abuse that he's experienced, does not negate the fact that the parishioner has experienced it, right?
absolutely.
So
And
you know what
yeah,
I'm saying?
thank you.
So it's
Yeah,
almost like,
thank you for that balance. Yeah.
yeah, it's almost like sometimes if you talk about the other side, it's like, oh, nah, nah, nah. It's almost
Yeah,
like
we're not
vilify.
dismissing we're saying that both exist. Yeah.
Right, right, right. We don't want to vilify, yeah. So anyway, you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, as a pastor who's been in ministry over 30 years, pastored and planted a church 16 years, man, I've experienced countless hurts that have collectively felt abusive,
Mm,
right? So I can't say that there's one person who is repetitively used their power and control to try to abuse me, but I would say the collective effort of that snowball of hurt has felt
mm,
incredibly abusive. Because look, we are in relationship with our sheep because we love them, we care
yeah.
about them, right? And we give our whole selves to them, right? We serve them, we shepherd, we preach, we encourage, we bury family members, we're there when babies are born. But what happens is, as soon as there is a misunderstanding, or as soon as um, something doesn't happen the way the parishioner would desire it, there is this disconnection from relationship, as if the relationship never existed. So it's just like having a family member or brother or sister that all of a sudden cuts you off or cancels you and does not
Mm,
create an opportunity for a conversation to dialogue about whatever the issue is or whatever offense that you have had against them, right? And so what you notice is that there is a disappearing act where people will just disappear, or
mm,
people will then have a conversation with you on the way out, not necessarily uh, in the moment related to how they have offended you, right? You know what I'm saying? So that is not only hurtful, but that's also abusive, because they're using their power and their control, and they're withholding relationship, and they're withholding love. So that has happened time after time after time after time, and and I've talked to other pastors. We've had conversations about it.
yeah.
Um, it's tough, because it makes a leader, or it makes a pastor, not necessarily want to invest his whole self. And that's why you have some pastors now, they're very selective about their time, even more, even in small churches. They're just selective because they don't want to allow themselves to succumb to that continue pressing on that wound or that scar
Yeah.
that has hurt their heart or broken their heart. And so what I'm trying to do too, like people do it amongst each other too, right? So, I try to oftentimes encourage my church, don't give up on relationship. Don't stop investing in relationship. Don't stop pouring your whole life into people, because sometimes people are afraid that people will just leave and cut them off or cancel them. You know what I'm saying? Um, so yeah, and I've seen too, people get hurt and it could be a legitimate hurt, and then oftentimes they just push that out on social media and seek to get the collective people to come against that one leader, when There should have just simply been a conversation. And everybody tends to want to get their story out there, which I understand and I appreciate it. But that does nothing for the relationship of those people who have uh, who have harmed them.
Yeah, you hit on so many points there, and it was a guy who tagged me in a rap, and
Hmm.
he saw my book was coming out, and he had a very pivotal line where he said, for the church, when you have church hurt, you can leave with it. He said, but I have to lead with it. And
Come on.
so oftentimes, people don't understand that the pastor doesn't have this just out. Like, they've been called by God to continue to shepherd people who may be hurting them.
Hmm.
And sometimes there isn't a conversation. I mean, there's a biblical example of this. I think it's number 16, the sons of Korah, that revolution against Moses,
Yes.
where
Yeah.
they had hundreds of people coming against him,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and then Moses is experiencing immense stress and anxiety. And
Hmm.
this is a whole nother conversation where you dig into the family of the pastor, not sure who they can trust, his wife,
Hmm.
does she have authentic relationships? And so it's just important, guys, as Dr. Bond said, we're not vilifying those who experience church hurt from leaders. We're not negating or dismissing that experience.
Absolutely.
But it's important for us to achieve unity within the church when we have all these sinners under one roof, that we recognize that pastors get hurt too. And sometimes pastors are experiencing it from several different people at the same time.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then they can't necessarily share it with you. you know and so it's just so
You're
important that
preaching, Doc.
no, I just want people to
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
I
There's
want
another
people to
side.
understand that sheep, yeah, like this, sheep got teeth.
Yeah, they bite. They
you
bite,
know
don't they? Yeah, they
yeah,
bite.
sheep bite, man. And so thank you so much for that. But so let I guess there's a second part to that question, man. How does church hurt differ for a pastor from that of a parishioner? Just what are
Wow.
some of those differences? Because
Wow. Wow.
hurt is not all hurt is the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, yeah. That is a brilliant question, and I think I want to make sure the parishioner understands that your pain is legitimate, right?
Yeah,
Your whatever you experience is legitimate. Whether you tease it out with a counselor or whatever, what you're feeling is what you're feeling. I think the pastor has the same right. I
yeah.
think some of the similar. Let me start with the similarities before I go into what I think is different. I think the pain is real for both. Let's say that's a similarity, right? The pain is real for both. Um, I think secondly, I would say each of them feel misunderstood and devalued,
Mm,
right? I think we can agree on that. Misunderstandings typically lead to hurt and pain. Um, I think it's hard to talk about it um, in order to resolve it unless they're private conversations. I think that's very similar. There has to be private conversations. Notice I said private conversations.
yeah.
It's nothing wrong with bringing a witness if you want to do Matthew 18, but there needs to be a private conversation. I think also the similarities are that relational blind spots um, tend to be present in the one who brought about the pain.
Mm,
They're just relational blind spots, and then it's always tethered to somebody's story. And for a pastor, it's a collective effort of hurt. And I'm sure with the parishioner, I'm sure it's a part of their story. They have been maybe harmed similarly before, which makes it worse. I would say differ. I just wrote a couple things down. Leaders may have more cumulative church hurt and
mm,
maybe more unresolved hurt than
mm,
parishioners. It's accumulation effect for the leader or the pastor, depending on how long they've been in ministry. Typically, for the parishioner, they are stung by church hurt, and then they are on guard, cautious, and alert as they move forward, which protects them from further hurt. Now, I'm not saying that a person has not been hurt multiple times by a church,
right.
but what happens is that person becomes heightened in its alert, and it can make choices based upon how it moves forward. Whereas a pastor typically he doesn't bounce from church to church. He typically stays in that one location. So it's more cumulative effect,
Hmm.
right? Um, Leaders try to cope with successive emotional and spiritual injury. Parishioners may disengage from the source of pain or the hurt or pain contributors and experience greater amounts of healing, right? Um, I think also leaders have limited spaces where they can talk about their pain that members or former members have caused, right?
Mm,
It's hard to find that space to heal because you have to be very careful about what you say
right.
because you don't want to be accused as a spiritual a spiritual abuser, right? But parishioners have the ability to speak freely with their social circles, or like I said, sometimes what happens in a toxic way, we go from people to people, or we even get on social media, and then unfortunately, that really negates the opportunity for reconciliation or any kind of redemptive conversations as it relates to that abuse or that hurt. Um, leaders don't seem as quick to get counseling
Mm,
until it's too late,
wow.
until something has happened where that person has cracked or exploded or done something problematic where now everybody is recommending counseling, but counseling should have happened a long time ago. Whereas parishioners seem to recognize the hurt and the need for getting healing, and then they kind of move in that direction, whether it's cyclical or slow or sluggish, they eventually get to the point where they experience some type of relief from it, right? Or some type of encouragement. Like you said earlier, I think leaders tend to stay at the location where they have been hurt, where
Yeah.
parishioners move to another church community,
Yeah.
or they avoid church altogether,
Yeah.
because it's been a source of relational pain, and that's heartbreaking for me because again, you got this hospital that is supposed to be for wounded people, but yet you don't go to the hospital. What happens when we don't go to the hospital? We just
Yeah.
die. You know what I'm
Yeah. It
saying?
can be
We
fatal.
die,
Yeah.
especially if we have something chronically in us. Hurt is sometimes like a disease, like cancer. It just eats away at us, and we eventually shrivel up spiritually, or even physically. Because I believe that even I believe the stress of church hurt even affects organs. That's a whole nother conversation.
Wow.
I think it wears out the body. Um, but yeah, I think that's the similarities, and I think that's some of the differences.
Wow. No, that's amazing. And I just think again, guys, we want you to just understand the immense pressure that leaders are under leading. The average church is like right at around 70 people. And so then you have churches that are even bigger and some smaller. But when you're leading a group of people, issues are going to happen. And so often pastors have expectations placed on them that they have no clue about until we fail you. And so until we fail an expectation we didn't even know that was on us to begin with. And then
Mhm.
oftentimes again that person just leaves while the leader has to continue to lead with this unresolved hurt, because a lot of time the parishioner won't even talk to you. And so it's
Mhm.
just so important again that we just understand how we're hurting each other so that we can prayerfully stop it, and so that we can have true unity and healing can take place. So one of
Mhm.
the things I say in the book, Dr. Bond, is I say that those experiencing church hurt have the experience that resembles someone seeing their abuser on a weekly basis. Can you break that down psychologically and emotionally?
Wow. Wow. Yeah. I think that hurt feels like you never can get away from it, right? You never can heal from it because you're always seeing that person who cut you, right?
Mm,
Or harmed you, right? Um, and even when you don't see them, you're thinking about it quite often. Or if you
right.
hear that person's name, right? Just anything related to that feeling that you've experienced can feel like a dagger, a trigger, right? Or a wound, right? So like somebody, like you got a band-aid and somebody's ripping off your band-aid and they're exposing your wound. And Because I think the person who has violated that person doesn't necessarily care in participating in their healing. Um, and
Yeah.
so and so what happens is you feel like it's just constantly wearing on you. Like I said, I think physiologically things are happening within the body whenever you see that person, right?
Mm,
Think about somebody who's offended you, or when you hear it. I've heard of people talking about things that they've experienced within the church, and then watching a movie, and then all of a sudden a breakdown, crying, or being another conversation that someone shares a very similar experience, and then they're just overwhelmed in the moment. Um, I just think it's a constant reminder of the relational fracture that can't quickly be removed. You just you can't remove it. So the person seems to just be hyper vigilant, alert, um, always anticipating some type of trigger. Um, and again, triggers are real. Um, yeah, I think some people losing sleep. I think it can become even obsessive. I've seen some people get hurt by church and church leaders, and it just seems like they're just obsessive. They think that their healing is just constantly talking about that person indirectly on social media, or posting something on social media. Like that's not healing.
mm.
That's participation in the cancel culture, and it's not helpful. It's not helpful. So I think from your perspective, I mean, you wrote that. I just think it's just a constant awareness, a constant reminder, and it just really takes time to heal from that stuff. And maybe later in the conversation, I can offer some suggestions on how
Yeah.
someone can move forward in that. But yeah, I just think it's just a constant. I think, and that's why I think we need to just address it. We got to address it by reading books like yours, but I think also address it by getting some help.
Yeah, we're definitely advocates for counseling here. Now, we're definitely advocates for getting counseling, getting therapy, processing your pain in a healthy way. I think what Dr. Bond is pointing out is, a lot of times we don't think about if there's legitimate hurt. It's hard for you to hear that person's voice, especially if you've been hearing their voice on a weekly basis delivering sermons, and they've hurt you, and it's through processing it, not going on social media blasting, but prayerfully processing it, and then maybe even being open to, hey, maybe there was a misunderstanding. Was it
Yes,
intentional? Was it unintentional? These
yes,
are things that need to come out through discussion. They don't
yes,
happen through assumption. And so
absolutely.
that's what we're advocating here. Now, with
Yeah,
that, no, oftentimes, people are in situations and they stay there, and it's real easy for people on the outside to say, why you didn't just leave? Why would you stay? And sometimes we don't know, people don't know that they're being groomed.
mm,
They're being manipulated. They don't know. So what are some signs of spiritual abuse?
wow. Well, can I say something real quick before I say
Absolutely.
something about that? I think too, like sometimes I've heard people accuse pastors of preaching about them
Oh,
from the pulpit. And again, I know that that happens. I mean, we're frail, fragile, sinful people, and sometimes that does happen. But I don't think that it always happens. You know what I'm saying? Like
yeah.
some people say, I can't sit under a pastor because he ain't gonna do nothing but talk about my business. I'm just like, no, that's not the intent. And a pastor's not just thinking about one person when he's preparing. Now, some
Right.
pastors potentially do. I'm not saying that, but let's be careful about just grouping every pastor in that equation.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember somebody said that I said something from the pulpit, and I was my heart was totally not in that direction, and anyway, it was a hot one. Anyway, your question I think is could be a dangerous question if they don't if they take what I say and just superimpose it upon something they've experienced within the church. So
Mm,
I would
okay.
say before I say anything, just just really understand the context. Everything that you experience is not abuse. It may have offended you and may have harmed you, but it's not necessarily abuse. Spiritual abuse is, and I'll read this definition that that I've come up with just to make sure I'm clear. Spiritual abuse is an intentional, habitual, and harmful manipulation of people and situations for selfish purposes. All right. And
Mm,
that it has to, it can't be like a one-off experience, right? And again, it does seem painful. It seems hurtful and harmful, but abuse is over time. It is habitual and it is intentional and it is harmful manipulation. When we see it, we just need to confront it. We need to clearly define what has happened. We need to investigate it, and then we need to get support um, in the midst of it. Let me just read something that Dr. Lisa Oakley says. She says it is characterized by a systemic pattern of coercive and controlling behavior in a religious context. Spiritual abuse can have a deeply damaging impact on those who experience it. This abuse may include manipulation and exploitation, enforced accountability, censorship of decision making, requirements for secrecy and silence, coercion to conform, control through the use of sacred texts or teachings, requirement of, of obedience to the abuser. It can also suggest that the abuser has a divine position,
mm,
isolation as means of punishment, and superiority and elitism, right? And again, I wanted to share that because I think that sometimes
yeah.
we put hurt in the category of spiritual abuse, and they're different.
Wow.
We're going to experience hurt in the context
Yeah.
of a community of sinners and redeemed sinners, and so, but abuse is a little bit different, and I think that some of the some of the circles have created this idea in people's minds that everybody has been abused spiritually, and it's not the case.
Yeah.
And church is just not a spiritual abuse warehouse. You know, remember Men's Warehouse back in the day? It's
Yeah.
not a spiritual abuse warehouse, right?
Yeah.
It is a place where you get hurt and you heal and you grow and you comfort people and you experience um, progress relationally, right? So you have a whole group of potentially dysfunctional people in their relationships, and they're all gathered in that house. Come on, it's somebody's gonna get hurt. But abuse is a little different, and I think we have to be very specific to make sure that our situation is lining up with the definition of spiritual abuse.
Yeah. And so I want you to hear this again. What Dr. Bond read is uh, a sign of it is not that it's a one time offense, but it's a repeated. So
Mhm,
please don't miss that word habitual, that it's
mhm,
constant. There's pride, meaning a refusal to acknowledge when they're wrong. There's a
mhm,
dismissal of your emotions and your humanity. And this is repetitive. And so those are some
mhm.
strong signs, guys, that Dr. Bond has laid out for us to, really look at and consider if we're in these situations. And, which is going to lead us to this next question. So if you're in that situation, Dr. Bond, how would you counsel someone in a spiritually abusive church or organization?
Wow, that's really good, and my heart breaks because I've talked to both sides of it, right? I've counseled both sides of it. I've counseled the pastor who was under the abusive leader who was controlling and coercive, and all he wanted to do was grow the church and be a big church. So the person felt used, felt misused and abused. I've talked to the parishioner who felt like that person just used their power to control and manipulate and
Mm,
isolate that person, where that person didn't even couldn't even get a hold of Jesus, because that person had deified himself
mm,
to be Jesus, and he used manipulation to control. So I would say I know conversations like this will jar something in your story or jar something in your heart or stimulate a need to now begin to process it. Some of y'all may even be in tears because you're being reminded of
Mm,
your pain and what you have experienced. And I would say that first of all, guard your heart from blaming yourself for being there or being in the relationship or being in the church. We are in a war, and it's a spiritual battle. And so, because you're in that relationship or in that church or part of that organization, yeah, be gentle with yourself. Um, Also understand that the intention of the person that harmed you may not necessarily may not have started that way.
mm,
They may have had good intentions, but because of the evolution of power or the structure, they were seduced into becoming an abuser. Okay, so yeah, so just understand that. I would say either way, I'm sorry that you experienced what you have experienced, but I know God's heart is good for you, and God's heart is good for His church, and so then I would say, clearly define and determine what happened to you, and determine whether it is actually hurt and pain that you've experienced, or is it really spiritual abuse? And again, I'm not saying that one is better than the other or both are, one. Yeah, I'm just saying that just really be clear. Um, and then also, I would say seek biblical counsel from a trusted source
mm.
that can not just analyze the issue, but also evaluate your heart. Um, Also kind of get a sense of what happened and then help you chart a course going forward. Um, I've seen many people healed, set free from church hurt as well as spiritual abuse. But I think you can seek healing and clarity. And so yeah, so after you come off this call, if it was helpful for you, I would say pray about next steps and and reach out to Pastor Jerome if you can get a hold of his book, but then also try to find some good, strong biblical counselors that can connect with you as a person, whether you be whatever ethnicity or gender you are, so that you can get the help, so that your counselor can help you chart a course going forward towards healing.
Now, thank you so much for that, Dr. Bond. And I want you to notice, guys, he didn't immediately go to leaving. Now, obviously, it can include that, especially
Mhm,
depending on the severity of the abuse.
mhm,
But oftentimes we assume that leaving is going to address our pain when we
mhm,
still haven't necessarily processed it in a healthy way. So again, we're not
mhm,
negating that leaving may be a path to health, a
mhm,
path to healing, but it's not the only path, and it's just important that we understand that. Last question, Dr. Bond. You know,
mhm,
we've talked about a lot. We talked about habitual abuse, distinguishing an offense versus a pattern, the difference between personal and structural church hurt. We've defined church hurt, but I want us to end here because I think this is crucial because people need kind of at least a direction for next steps. So, how can healing be achieved? And then, second part, does healing look the same for everyone? Because I think we think healing is a one size fits all.
Wow, man, that's a good question. I think, again, I think I've reiterated this over and over, but I would say healing takes time. Healing just takes time. Yeah, it just takes time, and it's different for everyone because everybody's pain is different, and everybody's experience is different, right? So
Mhm.
you experience what you experience in the context of your story. Like, I don't know how you grew up. I don't know what kind of parental relationship you had. I don't know what your relationship was like with your siblings. I don't know what you experienced growing up. If anybody harmed you, or if anybody, violated you, things like that, or anybody tried to abuse you. Like everybody's story is different, right? And that's why sometimes it bothers me when I hear podcasts of like, you know, airing a dirty laundry of a church experience where a leader hurt other people in that church. What happens is oftentimes people then take their issue and they superimpose it on that experience. But that was an isolated issue that was particular to that particular church experience. And it's not helpful to necessarily broadcast that, because then it causes people to rush to make their experience equivalent to that experience, which I just think is incredibly harmful. Sometimes this situation or these feelings are, you leave calls like this and maybe sometimes a little foggy. um, just remember that the truth sets us free. um, and if we can create spaces to heal, then God can begin to enter into our story of pain and speak to that. um, the challenge with pastors never have really a space to heal until they make that space, or that space is made for them.
Mm.
But if you're a parishioner, man, create space, sister, create space to begin your healing journey, and with the goal of staying connected with Jesus and getting back into the local church and getting active and serving. Why? Because God loves his church, right? God loves his church and God hates sin. One day he's going to redeem all things and restore all things, and and all this pain and struggle is going to be done away with. I would say again, um, find a good biblical counselor, somebody who can point you to Jesus, point you to the Bible for hope and healing, and invest your whole self in the process of healing. Right? Dive into it, um, and then also I would say, while you're in counseling, engage um, a healthy friend, and if that healthy friend is going to church, go to that healthy friend's church. You know what I'm saying? Like sometimes we say, sometimes we've been hurt by the church, and then we get counseling and we say, well, I'm not going back to the church until I get through this. Well, your friend may have a healthy church that you could be a part of where you can heal while you're in the midst of counseling. Don't give up on God's church. His church ain't the problem. Is unresolved conflict in the hearts of sinners, and blind spots in the leaders and parishioners that are causing some of this challenge and trouble. So,
Thank you so much, Dr. Bond. In the spirit of that, I'll respond to it because I didn't tell Dr. Bond questions from the audience, so I'll give him the option. But
sure.
Shani, my girl Shani said, is there something akin to battered women syndrome for those who are victims of spiritual abuse? What advice do you have for the loved ones of those in this situation? And I'll just respond initially, Dr. Bond.
Sure,
I
sure.
like what he said. You know, seeking that counsel, seeking that friend, and just like as a parent, there's that time you have to take them to get their shots.
Hmm.
And I remember taking both of my children, and I tried to distract them before the needle came. And both
Hmm.
of them kind of gave me this look after the doctor poked them, like, Daddy, you set me up.
Hmm.
And they started crying. But even though they were crying, they reached out to the same person who allowed the pain for
Hmm.
comfort in the pain. Now, what am
Hmm.
I talking about? Even though the church hurt you, someone in the church, God will still use the church to heal you. So I
Hmm.
think it's just important. That's what I would say, Shawnee, to that. Dr. Bond, any response? Again, it's totally optional, man. I know we didn't
Yeah,
plan for
yeah.
part, but yeah.
Oh, no problem at all. No, no.
Yeah.
I think when you're watching someone experience hurt and have divested themselves from the church, it's incredibly painful, because you're almost mad at the church that hurt them, but then
Right.
you also feel helpless because you see what it's doing to them, right? I would say pray for them, continue to model Christ-like love to them, being a tremendous witness to them, and then also invite them to spend time with your friends. If you're a believer
Mm,
and
mm,
you have good friends that can be the church for them, that can be a micro church that helps them understand and know that relationships don't have to be jagged, and they don't have to be harmful
Yeah.
and hurtful.
Yeah.
You can bring your family member into your Christian circle. Not that you're trying to identify and become a church, but you bringing them into your Christian circle just so that they can experience some of the counterintuitive realities of being amongst Christians. Sometimes that helps. What I've done in the past, I've counseled people who have been hurt by the church, and then I've invited them into smaller communities before I introduce them to the local church again. And those
Mm.
micro communities create an opportunity for them to test some things, for them to see whether they're going to be triggered and all that kind of stuff. And that family member can have conversations about how that experience was, and then take them to the next step. Let's go to the larger gathering. Let's sit in the back. Let's just see what the Lord does. We don't have to necessarily engage in relationship with people. We can sit in the back and just hear and then leave. You know what I'm saying? But that person, yeah, I know the heart is broken over that.
No, again, thank you so much, Dr. Bond. Listen,
Mm,
guys, please share this with people. I pray that this resource the Lord led me to write will be a resource that's available for help and for healing. There are questions at the end of each chapter because the goal is for small group discussion. And so
mm,
Dr. Bond wrote the forward, an amazing forward for the book. And so again, I just I just appreciate you. Just some encouragement for you. They said that's good, doctor. So I want you to
mm.
receive some of your flowers.
Oh,
Another one
thank
just
you,
said
Lord.
micro communities. That's good. So again,
Mm,
you guys, thank you for this. Again, I pray you will go out and get the resource. It's available now wherever books are sold, and that it'll be a resource that helps you, and is instrumental.
that's
But
wonderful.
of course, Jesus is the answer, and his church, as ugly as she is at times, as imperfect and inconsistent as she is at times, she is still his bride. And so don't
Amen.
give up on Christ. Don't give up on his church, but healing is available and it is in reach for you. So you've been
Mm,
tuned into another episode of The Urban Perspective with my brother, my counselor, my friend,
amen. Amen.
my fellow pastor, Dr.
Appreciate you,
Dwayne
guys.
Bond. We
Thank you,
love
man.
you. God bless you.
Love you.
Peace.
Peace.